Hello, good evening. It's Zoe Catherine here, and I've decided to do another podcast. So I wanted to do this podcast on humour. So I wanted to talk about the different types of humour and how subjective it can be, and some of the moral dilemmas of humour. I've been thinking a lot about how people often say that female comedians cannot be funny. I remember when I was 17. When I was 17 at college, we were media students, and one of my college tutors very rudely stated that he thinks it's impossible for a female comedian to be funny, and he looked me dead in the eye as he was saying that. I could see my 17-year-old self judging him for saying that. And he still felt like this was an appropriate thing to repeat a second time. As a tutor who was supposed to inspire us. So yeah. And I've heard that a lot. And when I read comment sections on things as well, I see that comment a lot. Women are not funny. Still haven't found a funny comedian. Go on anything, you will find hate. Look how much hate Amy Schumer gets. And I will agree, I also don't find Amy Schumer funny, but my personal take on it is the reason why there are less funny comedians is because of humour's connection to being offensive. And it's my personal belief that humour is often found in things that either make us feel uncomfortable, like uncomfortable truths, or sometimes things of the ridiculous nature that are very far from the truth, or in irony, humour's usually, it's the similar and the difference at the same time. That's what humour is, in my opinion, from what I've experienced. It's hard to explain, really, isn't it? If anyone tries to describe what humour is, it's a very difficult thing to define. It's just something you instinctively kind of understand. But I personally find that often dark humour, offensive humour, is often perceived as funnier than a lot of more light-hearted humour, which often can be considered tame or cheesy or cringy, or just not relatable, I guess. I think a lot of humour that's what it is, it's how we relate to it. If something's not relatable to us at all, then we can't envision this situation often, so it's harder to find it funny. I think that could be a lot of why a lot of guys don't necessarily find women funny as well. The fact that when they do talk about things that are related to being a woman, they can't necessarily empathise with the female experience. I do think that could be the types of guys that say women are not funny. I feel like those kind of ones possibly struggle to empathise with an experience that is not relatable to themselves. Probably females do relate more to certain male experiences than, even though we haven't had those experiences, just because I feel like from what I've seen and from what studies suggest, women are a bit more in tune with people and psychology on average. Again, not every woman, but we just take a lot more interest in people and observe people a lot more. So because of that, we probably are observing the things that men do. So I think because of that, we can possibly relate to their humour a bit more in a way. And also, I think there's also the other part where sometimes female comedians think that they have to talk about a female experience that's very specifically female, when in fact they don't have to do that. They can talk about unisex experiences. Perhaps we're getting more male comedians that are talking about, generalised experiences as well, possibly. I think, though, the major factor in this, going back to what I was originally going to say, is a lot of people really like offensive humour. Think about the card game Cards Against Humanity. It's just whatever's the most shocking is what makes you laugh the most, because it makes you feel uncomfortable. Because not that you're necessarily saying that these things are true, because some of them are just ridiculous and they're not true. In terms of just how offensive and ridiculous that idea is, and just to say it out loud, it feels like when you're a kid and you're in trouble and like in school, and you cannot laugh, because if you laugh, that's you're just going to be in even more trouble. So you really try and hold back and not laugh, and then because of that, it just makes everything so much funnier. It's like the taboo of it is what's invoking those feelings in you. And I think that's often what it is with offensive humour. Like, yes, there will be a percentage of sadistic people that genuinely do get off over mocking and humiliating people through humour, and I think that's definitely not the type of humour that I relate to or understand. But I do think that is different to general offensive dark humour, which is probably actually coming from a place of empathy, if anything, because a lot of the times it's like, these are the things you don't dare talk about normally, and now you're just saying it. And it's a shared empathy with everyone in the room that we all feel the same discomfort talking about it. And that's sort of where the humour's coming from. I think the reason why often women don't turn towards this sort of like darker humour or more offensive humour is because society has this slight expectation on women to be more kind and empathetic and to not risk offending people. So I feel like a lot of the times we go for tamer jokes because we know it won't be received well if we go for an edgier joke. I personally have had experiences where I've tried an edgy joke with people that had always said edgy jokes to me, and more offensive jokes than what my joke, and they actually got really offended by what I said, even though they'd said worse things to me like a million times over before. And I hate to say this, but I do think it was probably because I was female that they got more offended. And I don't want to say I know that for a fact, but just going by the patterns of seeing how offended people are by female comedians versus male comedians that say things that are substantially worse, just seeing the reaction, I had a funny feeling that that is the reason. Again, I could be wrong, this is just my perception, but that's how I took it. Because I couldn't think of many other reasons why it would be more offensive coming out of my mouth than theirs. Looking at some posts that I've seen for like Amy Schumer, she made a really poor, tasteless joke about someone whose friend had died, and some joke like, oh, we all thought, couldn't it be you? Which is a really awful joke, and I'm not saying I think that's a good joke, but I saw Jimmy Carr make a joke about some guy whose parents had died in 9/11, made some joke about them getting barbecued or something along those lines, and everyone thought it was funny, and he didn't really get a lot of hate for that. Like, he's still got so many admirers, he's not like cancelled like an Amy Schumer. He's not hated on the level an Amy Schumer is. Yeah, there's some people that don't like him, don't get me wrong, but he also has said a lot more offensive things than she has. I'm not saying I agreed with what Amy Schumer said, I'm not saying that I liked her joke. I also don't think she's funny either. I think her jokes often fall flat, she doesn't deliver them well, and I think she lacks originality. Talks about the same kind of subjects too much. It feels a bit forced sometimes. So I'm not saying that I like her as a comedian, but nevertheless, the amount of hate she got didn't feel like it was fair, if that makes sense. Not that it wasn't fair to criticise her, but more not fair to criticise her substantially more for others saying similar or worse things who are the opposite gender. I do think that it is interesting seeing how differently women in the comedic space are treated, and I do think that could explain why there's probably less funny comedians that are female. Because if you're always holding yourself back and you're not letting things flow naturally because you're fearful of offending people and you care too much about social approval, your jokes are just not going to be as good as the people that don't care about social approval. They're just not. And if you are going to get given more grief for it as well, I can understand why. Like, when you're in a big social gathering, a party, often there's usually like, it's mostly, I'm not going to say this is always the case because I've been in other situations where it's been the other way around, but most of the time there's usually like a guy that's like the clown of the group and he's making us all laugh. He's like the funny guy and he's just coming out with witty, clever comments and he's just funny, right? Or if you're in a more immature crowd, perhaps he's being more ridiculous, but you get my point. There's usually like some guy that everyone finds funny. And I've seen it before with guys where they've laughed at something that they're going to say before they've even said it, before they even know what they're going to say, they're already laughing. And part of me does think like this is a social thing where people like to categorise people as different things, different personality types, often based on what they look like, often based on other parts of who they are. And I think sometimes we even end up playing these things just because we know that that's what people expect of us, so we end up acting like how other people expect us to act. I don't think anybody, even like sociopaths that go against the rules, are completely immune to this. I feel like up to a point probably most people kind of cave into the pressure of how people see you. It just affects you on a subconscious level from an early age, so it definitely impacts your behaviour and how you see other people. And there's been studies to prove this. It's not just me being a lunatic. But in those situations, I've noticed it's usually the guy that's the funny one in a bigger crowd. But then when it comes to smaller circles, let's be honest, there is nothing funnier as a woman than being in your circle of all girls, like a small group, like how hilarious it can get when the barriers are broken down. When girls trust each other and they know they're never gonna snitch on each other and tell other people what you've said about people. Girls can be quite ruthless and quite hilarious behind the scenes, but no one would ever see that side to us because we keep it in our groups. So I think that's why a lot of the times people think women aren't funny and don't have good sense of humour, because we're the funniest when no one's watching. When it's just us in a small group where we know we're not going to be judged, that's when we've become the most savage and the most hilarious. That's my take. That's personally why I think often men don't, and sometimes even other women don't understand like how funny women can be, and why I don't agree that men are always funnier than women. I just don't agree with that. I think, not that I'm trying to put down men and say they are not funny, of course they are. I'm just saying, I think there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that people don't see. So then another thing that I wanted to talk about on this was how humour can be used as a weapon. I think it's really interesting how humour is different across depending where you live, and I've like watched a lot of videos, read a lot of comment sections about like how different cultures have different humour because the culture is different, so things can be viewed as more or less offensive depending where you are. And just the structure of things. There's apparently some cultures, according to the internet, I've not seen proof of this, I'm just reading what I've seen on the internet, but according to the internet there are some places where people just don't understand sarcasm or irony. Going into things, I've read that there's certain cultures where they do understand what sarcasm is, but it's seen as only negative. It's not going to be considered like a funny, light-hearted thing, like sarcasm can be a light-hearted thing in some cultures. And I wanted to talk about this because I think it's really interesting. I do think that part of the reason why people view people from other countries as like less funny or less sarcastic is simply because languages can be so different that when you translate the same words and the same sentences, it loses all its meaning, because in a lot of languages they structure sentences differently. Like some languages don't have pronouns, like some don't have certain connective words, some combine two words into one. So overall, if your language is just so different like that, when you translate that over, it's just not going to make sense, and the like subtle nuances of the humour are just not going to sound right. So it's hard to actually really measure humour in other countries. It's hard to actually know how good their humour is or how similar it is, because when the language is so different and the translation just sounds like very off when you use a Google Translate, of course that's just going to mess everything up, especially if there's wordplay involved. Like, some words have double meanings. Like, there's a lot of words in the English language that have more than one meaning. And when you take all that into consideration, when you hear a translated joke, it's just not going to sound right. So it's kind of impossible to really know, unless you can speak fluently in all these languages, like completely fluently in all of them, you're not going to really be able to accurately compare the humour. So I would say if you're like fluent in like said two different languages, you might be able to have like an accurate opinion on whether sarcasm is used or not, or whether irony is used. But if you've only got like a basic understanding of the language, then I would say you probably can't even tell. Like I once watched this video and it was showing like different jokes translated into English, and none of them made any sense in English. It didn't sound, it was just like nonsensical. But obviously that wouldn't be nonsensical if you understood their language, and the same will probably apply for us. It's like I joined this group called English in Japan, basically, where they have like things that translates over and it sounds funny. And there was one where it was it said something like, "Don't stimulate the monkeys" or something, and some people had wrote in the comments like, "I don't get whether that's funny, that actually makes sense." And when you think about it, it technically does make sense, because like the word stimulate, like obviously all it means is like having some sort of like reaction to something, I guess. So like if you feel overstimulated, you feel overwhelmed. But obviously because we use that word, it's so often heard as like sexually stimulating. We hear that phrase so much, we associate the word stimulating as like a sexual thing, even though it's not all, that's not the only purpose of the word, because we've heard that in the most contexts. We wouldn't usually typically use that word in certain contexts, which is kind of weird because we still do use it in some ways, because it's pretty common for people to say, "Oh, this is overly stimulating," when they mean like something's overwhelming. That's commonly used and nobody sees it as an innuendo. But I don't know, it's just the way this whole sentence was structured together sounds like an innuendo in our language. But like, I could understand like, how would you explain that to somebody? Because it was like, because like technically they haven't used the word "ron." That is like, if you play with an animal too much, you overstimulate it and then it can get rowdy or whatever. So technically the word is used correctly, but just the way it sounds just sounds wrong in our language. Like we just wouldn't use that word in that way. So stuff like that goes to show like how hard it would actually be to like understand another country's humour, even if these people can speak English. So even if like you can speak the language, you can still miss things if you're not brought up in that country, and if you haven't seen things from early in that country. Like you'll often hear like British people and Australians bragging of how like there's so much sarcasm in our humour, and there's this like little thing where we feel we have a bit of a superiority complex about our humour. I have to say, I don't know if it's true that other countries don't use sarcasm. Either way, I actually kind of do understand the argument as well that sarcasm is like a lowbrow humour. Like I've heard many people saying that sarcasm is the lowest form of wit. You hear that a lot in England, that's like a famous saying, and I actually agree. I do think sarcasm is not the best humour. I do think often we refer to our humour as sarcastic when we really mean that we use a lot of irony, which I think irony and sarcasm are a little bit different. Going back to what I was saying about humour as a weapon, I think sarcasm can be quite like, it can be quite condescending, it can be quite rude, like, in a way. But I think often like people use their sarcastic humour as like an excuse to like get away with being a bit rude and disrespectful to someone. Like, oh, it's just a joke, but really you knew they kind of meant what they said and they did try to belittle you a bit. And going back to like my my views on humour used as a weapon, I think humour can be used as a weapon in so many different ways, and that's something that rarely gets spoken about. And like I said, like, for example, humour is often used as a way to say cruel things to people and put people down or make people feel different to others, while being able to get away with it. And I also think as well there's a lot of people that don't understand when the right time to use offensive humour is as well, because obviously offensive humour is not the same as sarcastic humour. It's just like offensive humour. Some things like generalised, where you're talking about a general topic that's not necessarily aimed at any individual, and I feel like that kind of humour is less likely to offend. But, you know, generally speaking, generalised offensive humour is usually not taken too badly. But then there's like, if someone said something, made some sort of offensive joke about a specific topic that had just impacted you, that would feel very different. Like, if somebody knew that a recent family member of yours had, I don't know, passed away by some type of illness, and then that person made a joke about that illness, that would feel like a very personal attack, and it would not be taken well, in the same way as if they made this joke and it had nothing to do with you personally, if that makes sense. So I think, like, when people say, like, oh, and you can joke about any subject, and, like, we're all equal in the human world, we can joke about any topic, no matter how offensive it is, and it's all fine. I agree and I don't agree. Like I said, you need to know your audience. You can't just say anything to anybody, because people are absolutely in the right to be offended by what you said, especially if it feels like a personal attack against them. Again, I know that sometimes we accidentally say things and offend people, and we feel terrible about it, and we, like, genuinely just forgot that this was something that had impacted them, or perhaps they didn't realise a part of the joke and they thought it was more serious than it was. And I do think in those cases, an apology is still required, really. You still should apologise, because at the end of the day, if you made them feel that way, you made them feel that way. I think it's clearly that the humour wasn't being used deliberately as a weapon, it was just a communication error, which everybody has, because nobody's perfect. But I do definitely think there are people that intentionally want to hurt others with their humour and just hide behind that label so they can get away with it, and maybe even use it to manipulate people, because I have seen how if you mock a certain group and make them a target of your jokes, if you keep mocking them enough, eventually people can actually start to take a certain group of people or a certain person less seriously, because they start to, like, associate them with this joke or whatever. Some people will use their, like, dark humour so often that people will, like, they'll say something and mean it, and they'll just be able to get away with it, because they'll be like, oh, that's just Carl, he just says things like that, he doesn't mean it. But sometimes people are kind of blurring your reality a bit by making it harder for you to define when they're being sincere and when they're not. I think that's why humour can actually be so much better when it's among people that you really know and trust, because you know them well enough to know if they're implying something or not, usually, unless they're a master manipulator. But I think because most of the time with people you're very close to, you know what they mean by things, you know what they're personally impacted by in their lives and what they would and wouldn't agree with, you know what the political views are, so it's harder for you to get offended. But with a person that you don't know well, you might not necessarily know what their views are. You can never really know what they're hoping to gain by mocking certain subjects or certain types of people. So yeah, it's complicated, but I find it really interesting, and I think, like, it goes to show as well, like, how you really have to be careful, like, if you are, like, going to another country or working abroad somewhere, or whatever it is that you want to do, just speaking to people from different nations. You have to be careful with your humour. You don't want them to misunderstand you and take things the wrong way. Something I find interesting as well is the concept of, like, roasting people. And I think that's another thing. There's a huge difference between dark humour and roasts. Not long ago, someone put on a roast show full of, you know, famous comedians roasting each other. And watching that show, watching, like, multiple episodes back to back, I noticed, like, reoccurring themes. I think, like, most of the time they're not actually funny. Mostly because people say the same things over and over. Like, there's two different types of people. There's the people that really want to hurt the person they're talking to, and you can tell they're going out of their way to say whatever they think is the most hurtful or offensive thing to them. And then there's the other type of person where you can see, like, they maybe feel a bit guilty, they feel, like, a bit bad, and they don't want to go too hard on the person, so they try and roast them about something that's a bit tamer because they feel guilty. And then And like I feel like both of the times it tends to come off a bit lame, because the one where obviously they're being a bit tamer, it's like sometimes they're making jokes and it's like almost like a compliment, or it's just such like a lame joke. It's like, come on, no one's gonna be offended by that. And then when it's the ones that do say something really brutal, it's most of the time it's not very clever or witty. Most of the time it's like the same reoccurring things. But you know, at least if you were a woman on that show, you already know what the jokes are. So you're already prepared, because it's either going to be age or something about your sex life. Yeah. There's probably some of the only ones that were actually like funny were like a bit too offensive as well. I watched it and I was like, oh god, I don't know if I want to find this funny. It just felt a bit too personal. I mean, I know that's the whole point of it, but I just feel like, can anybody fully consent to being roasted? I'm just like, I feel like no matter how tough you think you are, if someone could just say that one thing that like gives you depression for the rest of your life. I don't know. For me, it's just not. It's not something that I see the point in, because like I said, most of the time it's not actually funny, and even when it is, it's like, it's just so negative. It's just constantly picking at the things that you can find about someone to humble them all the time, and I get bored of humble culture. I've had people try to humble me my whole life, and it's so boring, and you know, I'm just over it. I just want to see like a culture where like humour can be clever. Like, there's so many TV shows where, yeah, they might have the little offensive moments in them and stuff, but there's still like actual themes, actual storylines, actual relatable moments, and there's still like empathy in there. It's not just straight up a savage attack on someone. And like, yeah, and I guess it's one thing for like a lot of comedians that are rich and wealthy with amazing lives, and these are their careers. They're probably strong people that are used to being scrutinised more heavily than the average person is used to. But I do think it has a negative impact on school kids as well, because kids are going to bully kids no matter what, don't get me wrong. There is no way you can stop that completely. But you don't need to inspire them too much to get too good at it. Another way that I feel like humour can be used as a weapon is sometimes with, you know, satire posts where you see like political ones where people like mock a certain group and show how absurd certain political views, and I've seen them both on the left and the right. Every now and again you see a really funny one, like I've seen those ones where they mash up like words and they make a song which is about, you know, some sort of scandal or something, and I can't say they're not really clever and funny, because they are. I appreciate them, and I do think as well that free speech, we should be allowed to mock and voice our opinions through humour. And sometimes that gets the point across in the best way, to be honest. There's a lot of people that think politics are boring and that this is like the only way we can engage them. So if it gets more people interested in learning about things that are going on, then that's probably a good thing. So I'm all for it. But I do think like you have to have an open mind as well, and kind of, I've seen things from both sides where they're mocking craziness on both sides. And sometimes like there's more to the story, and often there is on both sides of the spectrum. There's usually more to the story. If something seems too absurd, instead of just like writing off the opposite position as a joke and how stupid and ridiculous they all are, probably look into it a bit more, because there's often a lot more to it than meets the eye. And like anything, most issues are more complicated than how black and white humour can often be. And, you know, if you look into anything too much, it becomes absurd, because just life in general is kind of crazy. So I feel like if you look at something for too long, you can find the flaws in anything. You can find the cringiness and the stupidity in absolutely anything. That's just life. So I do think you have to, you know, like, yeah, sometimes like our automatic reaction is to laugh at things when we feel awkward or when we don't understand them. Sometimes like it just takes that person that doesn't laugh and looks past that to help you to open your mind to something that's different, and you're like, actually no, this is kind of interesting, kind of cool, I can see where people are coming from. That's why I say humour is empathy. Like, so many people say they can't watch films, like comedy films, by themselves. They won't laugh, they only laugh when they're with other people. And yeah, I think it is like a unique bonding thing in a way. So I think like a lot of the time my natural reaction is to connect with whatever the majority is saying is funny and going along with that. It's like an instinct to do that. But sometimes I think people are grossly overlooking people because they're either mocking them or not giving them a chance. I do think humour can be a weapon in a way against that, and sometimes, yeah, you can laugh at something, but then just sit and think afterwards, like, okay, but let's think about that idea actually, let's break that down once we've got this out of our system, do you know what I mean? I don't know if anything I'm saying here is making much sense, but yeah, I just think it's a really interesting subject. And I would really love to know if anyone in the animal kingdom has a sense of humour. I would actually love to know. I feel like there's a lot more we could unpack about this whole subject, like, you know, like for example, like the whole like mocking of stereotypes, and sometimes there's some groups of people that are laughing at the stereotypes because they agree with them, and then there's other people that are watching the exact same thing and they're coming from a whole different perspective, where from their perspective we are making fun of the stereotypes, we're saying how ludicrous and ridiculous these stereotypes are, and because of that, the same joke can be interpreted two completely different ways, and two people with opposing ideas can be both laughing at the same joke. Yeah, there's that. I wanted to talk, there's so many things I'd love to just talk about with this subject, but, you know, I'll be on a tangent forever.